An American Army nurse vanishes in 1938 after a routine Sunday walk to mail her weekly letter. A picture found in 1978 in a condemned hospital basement shatters that neat explanation. She was ordinary on the surface. Steady shifts, a private journal, habits that made her predictable. The photograph is visceral and wrong. She sits alive but bound in a brick chute, terror fixed in her eyes as if recorded by a cold hand. The image points toward a celebrated surgeon and a clinical experiment that wears the uniform of medicine. Who protected that cruel genius for decades, and how many lives were catalogued as progress? The cavalry ward smelled of carbolic soap and burn salve, overlaid with something sharper, the chemical tang of fresh iodine and the copper hint of blood. Lieutenant Sarah Holloway moved between the beds with practiced efficiency, changing dressings on a private whose arm had caught fire during a training exercise. The boy, he couldn't have been more than 19, flinched when she peeled back the gauze, but she murmured soft reassurances while her hands worked with the gentle precision that had made her a favorite among the wounded. 12 hours. She'd been on shift since dawn, and her feet throbbed inside her regulation shoes. The October light slanting through the tall windows of the Fort Riley Base Hospital had turned from pale morning gray to the deep amber of late afternoon. Nearly 8 o'clock now, Sunday evening. "You're good to rest now, Private," she said, securing the final bandage. "Night staff will check on you at 10. The boy nodded, already half asleep from the morphine. Sarah collected her instruments on a metal tray and turned toward the supply room. That's when she felt it. The weight of observation, like a hand pressed between her shoulder blades. Captain Richard Daventon stood in the doorway of his surgery office, 30 feet down the corridor. He was watching her. Even at this distance, Sarah could read his expression, that particular combination of professional courtesy and something else, something that had intensified in the 3 weeks since she'd declined his proposal of marriage. He raised a hand in greeting. Sarah nodded back, keeping her face neutral, and walked toward the nurse's station. Her pulse had quickened. Foolish, she told herself. He's a surgeon, a decorated officer, a gentleman from a respected Philadelphia family. There was nothing to fear in a colleague's attention, except that his attention had changed. "Lieutenant Holloway." His voice carried down the hall, cultured and warm. "Excellent work today. That burn on Private Morrison, your dressing technique was impeccable." "Thank you, Captain." She kept walking. "Sarah." Quieter now. She stopped. He approached with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to deference, his surgical whites still immaculate despite a full day in the operating theater. At 42, Richard Daventon possessed the kind of distinguished handsomeness that made hospital trustees smile and nurses blush, silver threading his dark hair, steady hands, eyes the color of winter ice. "I wanted to apologize again," he said when he reached her. "For any awkwardness. I hope my proposal hasn't made things difficult between us." "Not at all, sir. We're professionals." "Yes, of course." A pause. "You're leaving for your walk?" How did he know that? But then, everyone knew Lieutenant Holloway took her Sunday constitutional to the Junction City bus depot, 2 miles each way, rain or shine, to mail her weekly letter home to Philadelphia. It was as regular as church bells. "I am," she said. "The weather's turning. Radio says there's a storm coming in from the west. I'll be quick." Something flickered across his face. Concern? Irritation. But he smiled. "Safe travels, then. See you tomorrow." Sarah escaped to the locker room, where she found Private First Class James Chen sitting on a wooden bench, his medic's kit at his feet and a sketch pad balanced on his knees. He was drawing again, this time capturing the angle of light through the window, the way it cut across the empty lockers in geometric slashes. "Still here?" she asked, pulling off her cap and unpinning her hair. James looked up. His ink-stained fingers paused mid-stroke. "Finishing up. You heading out?" "To the depot. Need anything mailed?" "Already sent mine." He studied her face with that particular attention artists gave the world, the kind of looking that actually saw. "You okay?" Sarah pulled her brown coat from her locker and shrugged it on. "Long day?" "He bothering you again?" She didn't need to ask who. Their friendship had formed precisely because they were both outsiders. She, a woman officer in a man's world. He, a Chinese American in a segregated army that barely tolerated his service. They'd developed a wordless understanding of each other's isolation. "He's just persistent," Sarah said. She picked up her leather nurse's satchel, checking that her journal was inside. She'd been keeping detailed notes lately. Observations. Things that didn't quite add up in the surgical ward. Patients waking with gaps in memory after routine procedures. Experimental compounds appearing in the pharmacy without proper authorization. Nothing she could prove yet, but enough to make her uneasy. "Want company on the walk?" James offered. Sarah smiled, genuinely this time. "You know what people would say." "Let them talk. You've had enough trouble already, James. Don't give them more ammunition." He closed his sketch pad with a sigh. "Just be careful. That storm's going to hit hard. I'll be back before it does." She left through the hospital's rear entrance, stepping into the cool Kansas evening. The sky to the west was already darkening to a bruised purple, clouds piling up like dirty wool. The wind had teeth in it, carrying the metallic scent that promised rain. Fort Riley sprawled behind. Her, barracks and stables, parade grounds and administrative buildings, all arranged in the rigid order the Army loved. Ahead, beyond the main gate, lay the 2-mile walk to Junction City along a dirt road that paralleled the Kansas River. Sarah adjusted her satchel and started walking. With each step away from the hospital, she felt the day's tension begin to ease. Out here, she wasn't Lieutenant Holloway, wasn't the nurse who'd rejected Captain Daventon, wasn't the woman scribbling troubling observations in a private journal. Out here, she was just Sarah, daughter of Catherine Holloway of Philadelphia, writing her Sunday letter home. She pulled the journal from her satchel as she walked, opening to the page where she'd left off. Her mother would want to know about the changing leaves, about the new library at the fort, about anything except the gnawing anxiety that had taken root in Sarah's chest. "Dearest Mother," she would write tonight, "the autumn here is surprisingly beautiful." The wind gusted harder, whipping dust across the road. Sarah pulled her coat tighter. In the distance, thunder rumbled, a sound like artillery, or perhaps like warning. She walked faster, clutching her satchel close, her journal pressed against her side like a secret she hadn't yet learned to tell. The storm was coming. She could feel it in her bones, in the electric charge of the air, and the way the light had turned strange and green along the horizon. She should have felt afraid. Instead, she felt the peculiar calm that comes before revelation, that quiet moment when the world holds its breath and waits for everything to change. Behind her, Fort Riley disappeared into the gathering dark. Ahead, the lights of Junction City flickered to life, small and distant, like promises that might not be kept. Sarah Holloway walked toward them anyway, because it was Sunday, and Sunday meant letters home, and some rituals were too important to break. Even when the sky promised ruin, even when instinct whispered, "Turn back," even when the life she knew was already ending with each step she took away from safety and toward a choice she hadn't realized she was making. The rain arrived in fat, cold drops that spattered the wooden bench and turned the dirt road to mud. Sarah hunched over her letter, shielding the paper with her forearm as she wrote the final lines to her mother. The words came slower now, weighted with things she couldn't quite bring herself to say directly. "The work here continues to challenge me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Sometimes I wonder if the difficulties are worth the cost." She paused, pen hovering. Through the depot's grimy window, she could see Edgar Hollis counting out the register, his movements hurried as thunder rumbled closer. The western sky had gone from bruised purple to a sickly green-black, the kind of color that made Kansas farmers board their windows. Sarah folded the letter quickly, sealed it in the envelope she'd already addressed. The wind picked up, whipping her coat open and sending leaves skittering across the platform. She needed to get inside, mail this, and find shelter until the worst passed. Walking back to the fort in this would be foolish. The depot door opened with a jangle of bells. Hollis looked up, relief crossing his weathered face when he saw her. "You best hurry, miss. I'm closing up early on account of the flood warnings. Kansas River's already rising." Sarah handed him the letter along with the coins for postage. "How bad do they expect it?" "Bad enough the sheriff's been driving through Junction City with a bullhorn, telling folks in the low areas to get to higher ground." He stamped the envelope with more force than necessary, as if speed might outrun the storm. "You got a way back to the fort?" "I'll wait it out under the awning. It should pass." Hollis shook his head, already pulling on his coat. "This ain't passing, miss. This is settling in for the night." He locked the cash drawer with a decisive click. "You're welcome to wait inside while I finish up, but then I'm headed home to my wife before the roads wash out." Through the window, the rain intensified from scattered drops to a solid curtain of water. Sarah watched it hammer the empty street, turning it into a shallow river within seconds. Lightning split the sky, illuminating Junction City in harsh white flashes. The closed storefronts, the Methodist church steeple, the few scattered cars racing for home. "I appreciate that," Sarah said, moving aside so Hollis could finish his closing routine. He worked quickly, checking locks, pulling shades, muttering about flash floods and the historic storm of 35 that had drowned 2 farmhands south of town. Sarah stood by the window, watching the deluge and mentally calculating. 2 miles back to the fort. Normally a pleasant walk. In this weather, dangerous. The boarding house was closer, only 8 blocks, but those blocks would be treacherous. She pulled her journal from her satchel, opened it to a blank page, and began writing by the dim light filtering through the window. The familiar scratch of pen on paper steadied her nerves. October 23rd, 1938. 8:45 p.m. Stranded at Junction City Depot by storm. Witnessed the severity of the weather firsthand. Flooding already evident on Main Street. Earlier today, noticed Captain Daventon lingering outside the nurses' quarters again. 3rd time this week, his attention has become... The lights went out. Hollis cursed softly. "There goes the power line. Happens every big storm." His silhouette moved toward the door, barely visible against the rain-gray windows. "Miss Holloway, I hate to put you out, but I really need to lock up and get home. You sure you don't want to ride? My truck can make it another few blocks to Mrs. Pemberton's place." Sarah closed her journal, weighing her options. Hollis's kindness was genuine, but his truck was old, and she'd seen it struggle in ordinary rain. The idea of being stuck in a broken-down vehicle with water rising around them held no appeal. "Thank you, but I'll manage. I'll wait under the depot awning until there's a break in the weather." Hollis nodded reluctantly, clearly unhappy with the arrangement, but respecting her decision. He held the door for her, and they stepped out together into the roar of the storm. The rain was deafening, drowning out everything except the occasional crack of thunder. Sarah pressed herself against the building's brick wall, finding the narrow strip of dry space beneath the roof overhang. "You be careful!" Hollis shouted over the noise, then hurried to his truck, coat pulled over his head. Sarah watched his taillights disappear into the downpour, leaving her alone on the empty platform. The depot window behind her went dark as Hollis cut the last of the lights. She adjusted her satchel strap, feeling the solid weight of her journal inside, and settled in to wait. The storm showed no signs of weakening. If anything, it grew worse. Water sluiced off the awning in a solid sheet, enclosing her in a capsule of relative dryness that felt increasingly fragile. Lightning illuminated the street in strobing bursts. Water ankle-deep and rising, a newspaper plastered against the general store window, tree branches skidding past in the current. Sarah reopened her journal, squinting at the page in the darkness. She couldn't see well enough to write, but she could think. Could organize her observations about the surgical ward, the Burns patients who couldn't remember their procedures, the locked cabinet in Daventon's office that appeared 3 months ago, his insistence on administering certain medications personally, without the standard nursing staff present. Headlights appeared through the rain, growing brighter. Sarah looked up as a dark sedan slowed in front of the depot, tires sending up sprays of water. The passenger window rolled down, and in the dim glow of the dashboard lights she recognized Captain Richard Daventon leaning across from the driver's seat. "Lieutenant Holloway!" His voice carried concern, pitched loud over the storm. "What are you doing out here?" Relief and wariness tangled in her chest. "The depot closed. I was waiting for the rain to ease. Get in. This isn't easing. It's a full flood warning. The MPs are already closing the fort gates to non-essential traffic. He reached over and pushed the passenger door open. Water immediately began pooling on the floor mat. Please, you'll catch pneumonia out here. Sarah hesitated, her earlier unease about Daventon's attention surfacing. But the alternative was staying exposed to a worsening storm, possibly all night. The boarding house was unreachable without wading through what looked like rapidly deepening water. And Daventon was still her colleague, a senior officer, someone she'd worked alongside for 2 years. Professional, offering logical assistance in an emergency. She gathered her coat around her, tucked her satchel close, and dashed the few steps to the car. Water soaked through her shoes instantly. She slid into the passenger seat, pulling the door shut against the wind, and the sudden silence inside the vehicle felt like a physical thing. Thank you, Captain. I wasn't looking forward to swimming back to base. Daventon smiled, his face cast in shadows by the dashboard glow. You'd have made it about 50 yards before the current took you. He shifted into gear, and the sedan began moving slowly through the flooded street. I was finishing some paperwork at the hospital when I heard the weather warnings. Thought I'd drive through town, see if anyone needed help getting to safety. Lucky I spotted you. Very lucky, Sarah agreed, watching the water sluice past the windows. The wipers beat a futile rhythm against the downpour. They drove in silence for a moment, the only sounds the storm and the laboring engine. Sarah kept her satchel on her lap, her fingers unconsciously tightening around the strap. The route toward Fort Riley should take them west on Junction Road, but Daventon turned south instead toward the river. Isn't the fort the other direction? Main road's already flooded out, Daventon said calmly, not looking at her. Sheriff's got it barricaded. We'll have to take the river road south, then loop back around. Adds 10 minutes, but it's higher ground. That made sense. Sarah nodded, settling back into the seat, trying to ignore the small pulse of unease in her chest. The river road was less traveled, narrow and unlit, but in weather like this, safety mattered more than convenience. Daventon's hands were steady on the wheel, his profile composed, professional. I imagine you're exhausted after today, he said. Ward was brutal. That cavalry private with the burns, tough case. He'll recover, the treatments are holding. Thanks to your care. Daventon glanced at her briefly, something unreadable in his expression. You're one of our best nurses, Sarah. I hope you know that. The use of her first name instead of her rank felt too familiar, but Sarah let it pass. They were alone in a car in the middle of a storm. Formality seemed unnecessary. I do my job, she said simply. You do more than that. You observe. You question. His tone remained pleasant, conversational, but something beneath it made Sarah's fingers tighten on her satchel again. That's a valuable quality in nursing. Attention to detail, curiosity about irregularities. The car slowed, pulling to the side of the dark road. Through the rain-streaked window, Sarah could see nothing but blackness and the faint shapes of trees bending in the wind. No lights, no houses, just the empty river road. Why are we stopping? Sarah's voice came out calmer than she felt. Daventon put the car in park but left the engine running. He turned to face her fully, and in the green glow of the dashboard, his expression was gentle, almost regretful. Because I can't let you keep asking questions, Sarah. I'm sorry. Before she could react, his hand moved with practiced precision. The small syringe appeared from his coat pocket, already uncapped, and he pressed it against her upper arm through the fabric of her coat and uniform. She felt the sharp bite of the needle, the cold burn of the injection entering her muscle. Sarah grabbed for the door handle, but her fingers were already losing coordination. She tried to speak, to scream, but her throat wouldn't respond. Her body began to fail from the periphery inward. First her hands went slack, then her arms, then the darkness closed in. The morning of October 24th, 1938, broke gray and sodden over Junction City. Floodwater stood 3 feet deep in the low parts of town, swallowing storefronts and telephone poles alike. Mrs. Greta Pemberton waited until 8:30 before telephoning Fort Riley. Her voice carried the particular tension of a landlady who has crossed from annoyance into genuine concern. "Lieutenant Holloway never came home last night," she told the duty officer. "Her bed's not been touched. That girl's never missed a night in 18 months. By 9 o'clock, Major Thomas Hartwell stood in the parlor of Mrs. Pemberton's boarding house, a 3-story Victorian that smelled of lavender and floor wax. Rain hammered the windows. He was a square-jawed man of 48 whose uniform bore the creases of military precision, but whose eyes had learned to calculate risk before seeking truth. "When did you last see her?" "Yesterday evening, around 7:30. Mrs. Pemberton twisted a dishcloth in her hands. "She said she was walking to the depot like she does every Sunday, to mail her letter home to Philadelphia." Hartwell wrote this in his notepad with methodical strokes. "Did she seem distressed?" "No more than usual." The landlady hesitated. "Though she's been quieter these past weeks, since that business with Captain Daventon." Hartwell's pen paused. "What business?" "The proposal." Mrs. Pemberton lowered her voice, though they were alone. "He asked her to marry him. She said no. A man doesn't take that lightly, Major, especially not when half the nurses on post would have said yes." Outside, the Kansas River continued its rampage through Junction City. By noon, the death toll from the flash flood stood at 2 confirmed, with 7 still missing. When Hartwell telephoned the bus depot, Edgar Hollis answered from the makeshift shelter at Junction City High School, where evacuees huddled with salvaged belongings. "Yeah, I saw her," Hollis said, his voice crackling over the damaged line. "Around 8:20, 8:30. Bought stamps. A sweet girl, always polite. She sat on the bench outside to write." "How long did she stay?" "Don't rightly know. Storm was coming hard, so I locked up early, maybe 10 to 9. She was still out there when I left, writing in that book she carries. I offered her a ride, but she said she'd wait for the rain to ease." Hartwell felt the first cold finger of dread. "What happened to the bench?" Static filled the pause. "Found it this morning, quarter-mile downstream. River took damn near everything on that block." By mid-afternoon, Hartwell had assembled a search team. 15 men waded through the floodplain south of Junction City, probing debris piles with long poles. The rain had finally stopped, but the sky remained the color of wet concrete. Hartwell watched from higher ground, methodically interviewing anyone who'd been near the depot Sunday evening. The night supervisor at the hospital, Lieutenant Dorothy Marsh, confirmed Sarah had left at 7:45. She said she needed to clear her head. That's what she always said before her Sunday walks. "Did she seem frightened?" Marsh considered this. "No. Tired, maybe. Thoughtful. We'd had a difficult case. A cavalry private with burns on 60% of his body. Sarah spent most of the shift with him." She paused. "But there was something. Last week, she asked me about protocols for reporting irregularities in treatment." Hartwell's attention sharpened. "What kind of irregularities?" "She didn't specify. Said she wanted to be certain before making accusations. You know how Sarah was meticulous about everything." The correction hung between them like a curtain. On the second day of searching, a private named Miller found a woman's shoe wedged in the roots of a cottonwood tree. Brown leather, worn at the heel, size 6. Mrs. Pemberton identified it as Sarah's. The search intensified. Divers arrived from Fort Leavenworth to probe the deeper channels of the swollen river. Hartwell interviewed Captain Richard Daventon in his office at the base hospital on the 3rd day. Daventon stood when he entered, his posture rigid with what Hartwell initially read as grief. "This is unconscionable," Daventon said before Hartwell could ask his first question. "Sarah Holloway was one of the finest nurses I've ever worked with. For her to be caught in that storm, it's senseless." "When did you last see Lieutenant Holloway?" "Sunday afternoon, in the ward. She was finishing her shift." Daventon's jaw worked. "I should have insisted she stay on base. I saw the weather reports, but Sarah was stubborn about her routines." "I understand you'd proposed marriage to her recently." Something flickered across Daventon's face, too quick for Hartwell to name. 3 weeks ago. She declined. I respected her decision." "How did that make you feel?" Disappointed. Daventon met his eyes steadily. But I'm not a child, Major. I understood her reasoning. She's dedicated to her career. She didn't want the complications of a military marriage. Was there tension between you afterward? No. The answer came too fast. Perhaps some awkwardness, but we remained professional. I valued her skill too much to let personal matters interfere. Hartwell made notes, watching Daventon's. Hands. They were surgeon's hands. Pale, precise, spotted with small scars from years of delicate work. They remained perfectly still on the desk. Did Lieutenant Holloway ever express concerns about procedures in your department? Now the hands moved just slightly. Concerns. Irregularities. Treatment protocols. Daventon's expression shifted to puzzlement. No. Why? Has someone suggested something? I'm following all lines of inquiry. Sarah was exceptionally observant, Daventon said slowly. If she noticed something, she would have reported it through proper channels. She believed in protocol. After Hartwell left, he stood outside the hospital breathing the clean post-storm air. Something in that interview troubled him, but the flood provided such a perfect explanation. The river had already claimed 2 lives. Why not a third? The answer came 3 days later. A young private named Coleman, assigned to drag the floodplains with a long rake, hooked something in the mud near the confluence of Wildcat Creek. He called for help, and 2 men dug through the silt with their hands. What emerged was a leather satchel, the kind nurses carried for personal items. Hartwell arrived within the hour. The bag sat on a tarp, water still dripping from its seams. He opened it with gloved hands. Inside, one cracked compact mirror with Sarah Holloway's initials engraved on the lid. Nothing else. No wallet, no identification, no journal. Keep searching this area, he ordered. 10-yard radius. Look for anything. Fabric, paper, personal effects. They found nothing. That evening, Hartwell sat in his office reviewing his notes. The satchel bothered him. It was too empty, too clean, despite the mud on its exterior. If Sarah had been swept away in the flood, her bag should have been filled with debris. Silt, vegetation, the detritus of a rampaging river. Instead, the compact sat alone in the leather interior as if placed there deliberately. He opened the file drawer and withdrew the complete missing persons report. Sarah's routines, her relationships, the timeline of Sunday evening. He drew a line from the depot to the river, calculating current speed and direction. Then he drew another line, this one from the depot back toward Fort Riley. Someone knocked. Private First Class James Chen stood at attention in the doorway, his face carefully neutral. "You wanted to see me, sir?" Hartwell gestured to the chair. Chen sat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The major had heard the whispers. Inappropriate friendship, racial impropriety, possible conspiracy. He'd learned to distinguish prejudice from evidence, though they often arrived in the same package. "How well did you know Lieutenant Holloway?" "We were friends, sir." Chen's voice was steady. "I'm a medic. We worked together in the ward." "I understand you're also an artist." "I sketch, yes, sir." "Did you sketch Lieutenant Holloway?" "Several times. She had an interesting face. Strong. The kind that shows what a person's thinking." Hartwell slid a photograph across the desk, Sarah's official Army portrait. What was she thinking lately? Chen studied the image. She was worried about something, wouldn't tell me what, but Sarah didn't worry without reason. "Did she mention Captain Daventon?" The hands tightened. "Only that he'd proposed and she'd refused. She was concerned it would make things awkward in the surgical unit." "Did it?" "I don't know, sir. I work in the general ward, but Sarah started keeping notes. She said if something seemed wrong, the only defense was documentation." Hartwell leaned forward. "Notes about what?" "She didn't say specifically, but there were patients coming out of surgery with memory gaps. More than normal anesthesia would explain, and she said Captain Daventon had started personally administering certain post-operative medications, bypassing the regular nurses. This was new information. Hartwell wrote quickly. "Did she report this?" She wanted to be certain first. She didn't want to make accusations based on suspicions. Chen's voice dropped. Sarah believed in the system, sir. She thought if she documented everything properly, the truth would protect her. The phrasing struck Hartwell like a blow. Would protect her, as if Chen had already accepted the worst. Do you think she's dead, Private? Chen met his eyes. I think Sarah Holloway was too smart to get caught in a flood, sir. She watched the weather like a pilot. She knew storms. If she's gone, someone made her gone. The accusation hung in the room. Hartwell knew he should reprimand such speculation, but something in the young man's certainty gave him pause. If I'm wrong, I'll accept any consequences, Chen added quietly. But you asked what I think, and that's what I think. After Chen left, Hartwell sat alone, pondering the implications. The interrogation room in the Fort Riley Administrative Building smelled of floor wax and old coffee, private, first class. James Chen sat rigid in a straight-backed chair, hands folded on the scarred wooden table before him. He'd been here for 3 hours. His sketch pad had been confiscated at the door. Major Thomas Hartwell stood by the window, arms crossed, letting the other 2 investigators do the talking. Captain Lawrence Finn, a red-faced man from the judge advocate's office, leaned across the table. Let's go through this one more time, Private. You spent an awful lot of time with Lieutenant Holloway, sketching her, talking to her, a white officer. James kept his voice steady. She was kind to me. We were friends. Friends. Finn made the word sound obscene. A Chinese private and a white nurse lieutenant. That's not friendship, son. That's something else entirely. We talked about art, about medicine. She respected my work. The third man, a civilian investigator named Wheeler, circled behind James's chair. You know what people are saying, Chen? They're saying maybe you got too friendly. Maybe she tried to cool things off and you didn't take it well. James's hands tightened until his knuckles went white. That's not true. You were seen walking with her. Alone, multiple times. In the hospital corridors, during shifts. You gave her drawings, sketches of the ward, medical illustrations. She was helping me improve my anatomical accuracy. Finn slapped his palm on the table. Or maybe you were obsessed with her. Maybe you followed her that Sunday night. Maybe when she rejected you. She didn't. James stopped, took a breath. I didn't go with her. I offered. She said no, to protect me from exactly this kind of gossip. The last time I saw her, she was leaving the hospital alone. Major Hartwell finally spoke from his position by the window. What was her state of mind that evening, Private? James turned toward the only voice that had addressed him with any measure of respect. Tired. Worried. Worried about what? The young medic hesitated. This was the truth Sarah had trusted him with, and now they wanted to twist it, use it to paint him as unstable or conspiratorial. But what did his reputation matter if it might help find her? She'd been noticing things, in the surgical ward, patients who couldn't remember parts of their treatments, medications being administered that weren't in the standard protocols. Wheeler leaned in. And she told you this? Why you? Because I listened. Because I believed her. Finn snorted. Or because you both like to imagine conspiracies, make yourselves important. She was documenting it, in her journal. Real observations, not imagination. Hartwell shifted. The journal that's missing. Yes, sir. Convenient. The word landed like a slap. James felt something crack inside him, weeks of grief and fear and the accumulated weight of 1,000 small indignities. His voice rose despite himself. She was the best nurse in that hospital. She cared about her patients more than anyone. And now she's gone, probably dead, and all you care about is whether a Chinese private dared to be her friend. The room went silent. James realized he was standing. His chair knocked backward. He was shaking. Finn's expression turned hard and satisfied as if James's outburst confirmed every suspicion. Sit down, Private. James didn't move. You're asking the wrong questions. You should be asking about Captain Daventon. Watch yourself, Wheeler warned. She rejected his marriage proposal 3 weeks ago. She told me he'd been acting strange ever since, watching her, following her routine. Hartwell's eyebrows lifted slightly. Captain Daventon is a respected surgeon from a distinguished family. You're making serious accusations. I'm telling you what she told me. James's hands were trembling now, but his voice had found its strength again. She said he knew her schedule. He knew she walked to the depot every Sunday. She said he'd started, asking her questions about what she'd been writing in her journal. And you didn't think to report this? Finn demanded. Report what? A senior officer paying attention to a nurse? She was trying to figure out how to document the medical irregularities first, build a case. She wanted to follow proper channels. How noble, Wheeler muttered. Major Hartwell pushed off from the window and approached the table. His expression was unreadable. Private Chen, did Lieutenant Holloway seem afraid of Captain Daventon? James met his gaze. Not afraid, uneasy. She said he was brilliant, but that something had changed in him, that he'd become too interested in his research, too focused on results over patients. That's not fear. That's professional disagreement. She wouldn't have been caught in that flood, sir. James heard the desperation creeping into his voice and didn't care. Sarah was from Philadelphia. She'd walked city streets in worse weather. She checked conditions, planned routes. The Sarah Holloway I knew would never have been careless enough to drown. The room fell quiet again. Finn and Wheeler exchanged glances. Hartwell studied James's face. The flood was severe, Private. 2 other people died. Good, capable people. Then where's her body? Where's her journal? Why was her satchel empty except for a compact? The river would have filled it with mud and debris. It was too clean. Someone emptied it. Finn stood abruptly. That's enough. Your testimony is inconsistent and emotionally compromised. We're done here. I'm telling the truth. You're telling fantasies. Finn gathered his papers. Major, this boy's unreliable. He's obviously suffering from some kind of attachment delusion. Hartwell didn't respond immediately. He kept watching James, who stood there breathing hard, feeling the walls of his military career closing in around him. Sir, James said quietly, please, just look at Captain Daventon's records, his patient files, the medications he's been ordering. Sarah kept notes about which patients experienced memory loss. If you compare them to his surgical schedule, dismissed, Private, Hartwell said, not unkindly. Return to your barracks. James wanted to argue, to make them see, but the futility of it settled over him like a heavy coat. He was a Chinese-American enlisted man accusing a white officer from a powerful family. His words carried no weight in this room, no matter how true they were. He saluted mechanically and turned to leave. At the door, Hartwell's voice stopped him. Private Chen, I'm sorry for your loss. The unexpected sympathy was somehow worse than the accusations. James nodded without turning around and walked out into the November cold. 3 weeks later, James stood at attention in Major Hartwell's office while the Provost Marshal read from an official document. Lieutenant Sarah Catherine Holloway, United States Army Nurse Corps, is hereby declared presumed dead by misadventure, having been caught in the flash flood of October 23, 1938. Case closed, December 2nd, 1938. The words sounded hollow, ceremonial. James stared at a spot on the wall behind Hartwell's head. The major set down the paper. I know you cared about her, Private. I'm sorry we couldn't bring you better answers. Did you look at Daventon's files, sir? Hartwell's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Captain Daventon has been cleared of any suspicion. His family has requested privacy during this difficult time. So that's it. She's just gone, and nobody's responsible. Sometimes there are no villains, Private, just tragedies. James didn't believe that, and from the way Hartwell's jaw tightened, he suspected the major didn't quite believe it either. But belief didn't matter. The case was closed. That evening, alone in his bunk, James opened his sketchpad to a drawing he'd made weeks earlier. Sarah in profile, her hair pinned beneath her cap, her expression focused and kind as she bandaged a patient's arm. He'd captured her perfectly, the gentleness and the steel. He would carry this drawing for 40 years, through a war, a marriage, grandchildren. He would carry it as evidence, as memorial, as the only proof that he'd known the truth when no one would listen. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall over Fort Riley, covering the ground where a woman's last footsteps had long since washed away, leaving only questions that would sleep for decades in sealed files and silent consciences. The Philadelphia parlor held its winter chill like a grudge. Mrs. Catherine Holloway sat in the same wingback chair where she'd received the telegram 3 weeks earlier, the folded flag resting in her lap like a sleeping cat. Outside, sleet tapped against the windows of the narrow Kensington row house, a rhythm as persistent as her grief. She'd ironed the flag this morning. Foolish, perhaps, but she couldn't bear the creases. The official letter lay on the tea table beside her untouched breakfast. We regret to inform you that your daughter, Lieutenant Sarah Catherine Holloway, has been declared presumed dead by misadventure. The words blurred together now. She'd read them so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. Sarah's last letter sat beneath it, postmarked October 22, 1938. Mother, the work here is hard but necessary. I'm learning so much. Please don't worry. I'm careful, always. All my love, your Sarah. Careful, always. Mrs. Holloway pressed the flag to her chest and wept without sound, the way she'd learned to do in the weeks since the world had stolen her only child and called it an accident. Spring 1939 arrived with dogwoods blooming along the Schuylkill River, but Mrs. Holloway's parlor remained frozen in December. She stopped answering the door. Neighbors left casseroles on the stoop that went untouched. By summer, the bank began foreclosure proceedings. By autumn, Catherine Holloway was buried 3 plots down from where Sarah's memorial stone stood, a marker without a body, a mother without answers. The row house was sold to a young couple expecting their first child. 2,000 miles west, in San Francisco's Chinatown, James Chen stood at the window of his second-floor apartment above a herbalist's shop. February 1941. Rain streaked the glass, distorting the neon signs below into bleeding colors. Behind him, his new wife May hummed while preparing dinner, the scent of ginger and green onions filling their small home. She was pregnant, 3 months, and the knowledge filled James with a terror he couldn't name. You're thinking about her again, May said quietly, not turning from the stove. James didn't answer. In his hand, wrapped in tissue paper, was the sketch he'd made of Sarah in August 1938. She was smiling in it, looking up from a patient chart, her nurse's cap slightly askew. He'd drawn it during a quiet moment in the ward, capturing the precise angle of her concentration, the kindness in her eyes. He'd carried it through his discharge, through the prejudice that followed him even after the Army released him, through the nightmares where he heard her voice calling from dark water. They didn't believe me, he said finally. They thought I know what they thought. May set down her wooden spoon and crossed to him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. But I know what you are. A good man. An honest man. James carefully rewrapped the sketch and tucked it into the wooden box where he kept his discharge papers. I should have done more. You told the truth. That's all anyone can do. He pulled May close, breathing in the scent of her hair, but even as he held his wife, even as their future grew inside her, part of James remained in that interrogation room at Fort Riley, helpless and disbelieved, watching justice slip away like water through his fingers. Fort Riley, Kansas, June 1943. Captain Richard Daventon, now Major Daventon, stood in the new burn treatment facility, reviewing treatment protocols with a fresh batch of medical officers rotating in from field hospitals in North Africa. The war had been good to his career. His methods for treating severe burns had saved dozens of lives, earned him commendations, positioned him for promotion to lieutenant colonel. The key is maintaining patient consciousness during the initial debridement, he explained, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man accustomed to deference. Traditional anesthesia can complicate healing. A measured paralytic approach allows for— His adjutant knocked, interrupting. Sir, the new supply manifest needs your signature. Daventon excused himself and followed the young lieutenant into the hallway. The newer wing of Fort Riley's hospital smelled of fresh paint and antiseptic. Nothing like the old administrative building that now housed only storage and forgotten records. He never looked in that direction when he crossed the parade ground. Never thought of the basement coal chute or what lay sealed in its darkness. Never allowed himself to remember the sound of fingernails on brick or the way consciousness could persist long past mercy. By 1945, he was a full colonel. By 1950, his textbook on burn treatment was required reading in every Army medical school. By 1955, the old hospital administrative wing was officially decommissioned, its crumbling brick facade deemed structurally unsound. A chain-link fence went up around it with signs warning, "Condemned building, no trespassing." The weeds grew tall around its foundation. Pigeons nested in its broken windows. And in its basement, sealed in absolute darkness, a leather journal and a photograph waited with the patience only the dead possess. San Francisco, Christmas, 1962. James Chen, now 56 with streaks of gray in his dark hair, sat at his kitchen table reading the obituaries. His daughter Alice, named after May's mother, was visiting from Berkeley, where she studied nursing. His son Robert helped May prepare dinner, the smell of roast duck filling their crowded apartment. The obituary was small, easily missed. Richard Alastair Daventon, Colonel, Returner, U.S. Army Medical Corps, died peacefully December 18th at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. Survived by his daughter, Evelyn Lockridge Daventon, a decorated veteran and pioneering researcher in burn treatment methodology. James's hand trembled. The paper rattled. "Dad?" Alice touched his arm. "Are you okay?" He stared at Daventon's name, at the word peacefully, at the litany of honors and achievements. No mention of Sarah Holloway. No mention of October 23, 1938, or a missing journal, or questions that were never asked. Died peacefully. "Dad?" James carefully folded the newspaper and set it aside. "I'm fine, sweetheart." But that night, he dreamed of Sarah sitting on a bench in the rain, writing in her journal, looking up at him with that same trusting smile. In the dream, she said, "Someone will find it, James. Someone will know the truth." He woke before dawn, May sleeping peacefully beside him, and prayed she was right. Fort Riley, Kansas. May 1975. The base had transformed across the decades. New barracks, modern medical facilities, updated training grounds. But the condemned hospital wing stood like a rotten tooth in the landscape, too expensive to demolish during budget cuts, too unsightly to ignore. Finally, appropriations came through. A local contracting firm, Krieger & Sons Construction, won the bid. Demolition was scheduled to begin in June 1978. The building waited, patient as a grave. Philadelphia, March 1977. In Oak Lawn Cemetery, Sarah Holloway's memorial stone had weathered to near illegibility. The plot beside it held her mother's grave, both tended now only by the caretaker's weekly mowing. No living relatives remained. No one left to remember except an aging Chinese-American man 3,000 miles away, who sometimes woke from nightmares calling a name from 40 years past. The stone read, Lieutenant Sarah Catherine Holloway, 1909 to 1938, beloved daughter, faithful servant, forever missed, forever lost, but not, as it turned out, forever silenced. Fort Riley, Kansas, June 1978. Dale Krieger's crew arrived on a Tuesday morning, the Kansas sun already brutal at 8 a.m. The condemned hospital building cast a long shadow across the parade ground. Dale, 45 years old and built like the machinery he operated, surveyed the structure with the practiced eye of a man who'd torn down dozens of buildings across 3 counties. "Straight demo job," he told his crew. "Foundation solid enough will salvage the basement brick if it's clean. Start on the south wall, work north." They set up their equipment, joking about the building's institutional ugliness, making bets on what forgotten crap they'd find inside. Someone mentioned the place used to be a hospital back during the Depression. Probably full of old bedpans and creepy medicine bottles. Young Terry Morrison laughed, swinging a sledgehammer onto his shoulder. Dale assigned Terry the basement detail. "Clear out any loose debris before we bring in the heavy equipment. Holler if you find anything structural we need to work around." Terry descended into the dusty basement, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The space smelled of mold and time. Old filing cabinets lined one wall, empty and rusted. The concrete floor was cracked but stable. In the far corner, a section of brick wall looked different. Newer mortar, cleaner lines. He called up to Dale. "Got some weird brickwork down here. Looks like someone patched a coal chute or something. Can you get through it or we need to go around?" Terry shrugged and grabbed his sledgehammer. "One way to find out." He swung. The hammer punched through the brick with surprising ease, revealing darkness beyond. He swung again, widening the hole. Cool, dry air rushed out. Air that hadn't moved in 40 years. Terry leaned in with his flashlight. Then he started screaming. The sledgehammer rang against brick with a dull, hollow thud that sent dust spiraling through the basement's stale air. Dale Krieger adjusted his grip, sweat darkening the collar of his workshirt despite the June coolness seeping through the old hospital's broken windows. Behind him, two younger crew members hauled debris toward the stairs, their voices echoing off concrete walls that hadn't heard conversation in 23 years. "Foundation's solid enough," Dale called over his shoulder, running a calloused hand along the mortared seam. "Just gotta clear these interior partitions before we can drop the main supports." He swung again. This time the hammerhead didn't bounce, it punched clean through, the momentum nearly pulling him forward into the sudden void. Brick fragments clattered into darkness beyond. Dale steadied himself, frowning at the ragged hole. Well, hell. Terry Morrison, barely 20 with a sparse mustache he kept trying to will into fullness, wandered over. "Hit a pocket?" "Looks like." Dale knocked the sledgehammer's handle against the surrounding wall, listening to the answering hollowness. "Whole section's bricked off. Must have sealed up an old coal chute or something when they decommissioned this wing. Want me to widen it so we can see what's inside?" Dale considered, then shook his head. "I'll do it. You go check if Williams needs help with that beam upstairs." He waited until Terry's boots clomped up the wooden steps before turning back to the wall. The hole expanded with each measured strike. Dale worked methodically, the way his father had taught him on demolition sites across Kansas. Respect old buildings, they always held secrets. Could be structural damage, could be forgotten equipment, could be nothing but rats and coal dust. Still, something about the sealed space made the hair on his forearms prickle. When the opening reached shoulder width, he set down the hammer and pulled his flashlight from his tool belt. The beam cut through decades of trapped air, illuminating brick walls that formed a narrow vertical shaft about 4 feet square. A coal chute, just like he'd thought. Probably led up to some exterior hatch that got bricked over when the hospital switched to oil heating in the 50s. The light swept downward, across walls streaked with old soot, across a floor littered with crumbled mortar and... Dale's breath caught. The skeleton sat with its back against the far wall, legs splayed, skull tilted forward as if the person had fallen asleep waiting for rescue that never came. Scraps of brown fabric clung to the bones, so rotted they'd taken on the color of the brick dust that coated everything. But it was what rested in the skeleton's lap that made Dale's hands go numb. A leather journal, dark brown and somehow intact despite 4 decades of abandonment. And beside it, face up on the thigh bones, a photograph. Even from this distance, even in the flashlight's uncertain beam, Dale could see the woman in the photo. She was wearing a military uniform. Her hands were bound. Her eyes... Jesus Christ! The words came out strangled. Dale stumbled backward, his boot catching on a chunk of concrete. He went down hard on his tailbone, the flashlight spinning from his grip to roll across the floor. Its beam swept wild arcs across the ceiling before coming to rest, pointing at the hole he'd opened. From upstairs, Terry's voice carried down. "Boss, you okay? Heard a crash." Dale couldn't answer, couldn't move. He stared at that ragged opening in the brick, at the darkness beyond that now held something his mind refused to categorize as just another demolition discovery. Footsteps thundered on the stairs. Terry appeared, Williams close behind, both of them taking in Dale's position on the floor with identical expressions of concern shifting rapidly toward alarm. "What happened?" Terry crouched beside him. "You hurt?" "There's—" Dale's voice cracked. He cleared his throat, pointed at the hole with a hand that trembled despite his best effort to steady it. "There's someone in there." Williams, a Vietnam vet who'd seen his share of bodies, moved to the opening first. He picked up Dale's flashlight and aimed it through. The silence stretched for 5 long seconds. "Son of a bitch," Williams breathed. "Terry, go to the site trailer. Call the Fort Riley police. Tell them we found human remains." He paused, the flashlight beam holding steady on something Dale couldn't see from his position on the floor. "Tell them it looks like a crime scene. Old one, but deliberate." Terry's face had gone the color of old paste. Are those bones?" "Move, kid. Now." Terry bolted for the stairs, his boots clattering double time. Dale finally managed to haul himself upright, joints protesting. Williams stood at the hole like a sentry, the flashlight's glow spilling around his silhouette. "You see that photo?" Williams asked without turning. "Yeah." Woman in a nurse's uniform, hands tied, scared out of her mind. Williams' voice had gone flat, professional, the way men talk when they're working hard not to feel. "This wasn't any accident. Somebody put her in there." Dale moved closer despite every instinct screaming to get out of this basement, out of this building, away from whatever horror had been waiting 40 years for his sledgehammer to set it free. He looked through the opening again, forcing himself to really see. The skull's empty sockets seemed to stare at the bricked-up entrance. The bones of the hands were positioned near the wall, fingers curled as if they'd clawed at brick until strength failed. And that journal, that photograph, both placed so carefully, so deliberately on the lap. "She was alive when they sealed her in," Dale said quietly. Williams nodded. "See those scratch marks on the brick? Inside surface." Dale saw them now. Deep gouges in the mortar between bricks at about shoulder height. The kind of desperate marks left by someone fighting against the inevitable. The air in the basement suddenly felt too thin. Dale backed away from the hole, his mind racing through implications he couldn't quite grasp. Whoever this woman was, she'd died slow in the dark, knowing exactly what was happening, maybe hearing her killer on the other side bricking up her tomb. And she'd been here, right here beneath their feet, while the hospital operated above her, while it got decommissioned, while it stood empty for 23 years. "How long you think?" Williams asked. "Long time. Look at the fabric, the bones." Dale swallowed against the bile in his throat. "Decades, maybe. Journal and photo don't look as old. Dry air, sealed space, things last in those conditions." Dale had cleared out enough old buildings to know how preservation worked. But that knowledge didn't make this any easier to process. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Terry must have convinced the police this was urgent. Williams finally stepped back from the hole, killed the flashlight. "They're going to shut down the whole site." "Good." Dale meant it. Let someone else deal with this. Let the proper authorities catalog and photograph and remove. He was done swinging hammers in this basement. The sirens cut off outside. Footsteps crossed the floor above, voices calling out. Williams moved to the stairs to guide them down while Dale stood in the settling dust, staring at the hole he'd opened. He thought about that photograph, the woman's expression, captured in some long-ago moment of pure terror. Someone had taken that picture. Someone had put it in the coal chute with her body. Someone had wanted it found. The first policeman descended the stairs, a Fort Riley MP with sharp eyes and a tape recorder already running. Behind him came a plainclothes detective, older, moving with the careful precision of a man who'd learned not to contaminate crime scenes. Dale told them about the demolition work, the sledgehammer, the hollow wall. He told them what he'd found. The detective listened without interrupting, his expression growing harder with each detail. "Nobody touches anything," the detective said. "We need CID down here, forensics, the works." He moved to the opening, produced his own flashlight, conducted the same careful examination Williams had performed. When he turned back, his face was grim. "This is going to be a long night, gentlemen. None of you are leaving until we get full statements." Dale nodded. He'd expected as much. He found a relatively clean patch of concrete and sat, back against the wall, while the basement filled with investigators and equipment and camera flashes that turned the coal chute's interior into a strobe-lit chamber of horrors. Through it all, he couldn't stop thinking about that photograph. About how the woman's eyes had held something beyond fear. They'd held the terrible knowledge of betrayal, of trust given to someone who'd repaid it with darkness and suffocation, and 40 years of silence. Someone was going to have to tell her family. Someone was going to have to explain how she'd ended up here, why no one had found her, who'd done this. Dale watched the forensics team carefully extract the journal and photograph, sealing them in evidence bags with reverent precision. One of the techs held the photo up to the light, studying it closely. "There's writing on the back," she called to the detective. He moved to her side, squinting at the reversed text visible through the photo's translucent backing. His jaw tightened. "What's it say?" someone asked. The detective's voice came out cold as the bones in that coal chute. "It's dated October 23rd, 1938. Says, for the advancement of knowledge, signed with initials R.D. 40 years, the woman had been here 40 years, and her killer had documented it like a medical experiment. Dale closed his eyes, but the image of that photograph burned against his eyelids. He knew he'd be seeing it for a long time to come. The face of someone who'd died knowing the world had forgotten her, sealed away like a specimen in a jar. The advancement of knowledge. What kind of monster signed their work? The portable work lights cast harsh shadows across the basement's exposed walls, turning the sealed coal chute into a stage. Detective Paul Thornton, 32 years old, and 2 years into Army CID, had investigated financial fraud and AWOL cases, but nothing like this. He crouched at the opening, watching the photographer document everything before they disturbed the scene. "Ready when you are, sir," the photographer said, stepping back. Thornton pulled on fresh gloves and squeezed through the gap Dale Krieger's sledgehammer had created. The air inside tasted dead, not rotting, but preserved, like opening a tomb that had been holding its breath for 40 years. The skeleton sat against the far wall, vertebrae curved in a position that suggested she'd been conscious when the bricks went up. Conscious and trying to get small, to disappear into the corner where there was no escape. The brown coat had mostly disintegrated, but enough fabric remained to show where the wool had been. Beneath it, fragments of a dark uniform, and in what would have been her lap, resting as deliberately as if someone had arranged them yesterday, a leather journal and a photograph. Thornton lifted the journal first, surprised by its weight. The leather had survived remarkably well in the dry, sealed space. He opened it carefully. The first page showed neat cursive. Property of Lieutenant Sarah C. Holloway, U.S. Army Nurse Corps, Fort Riley, Kansas. Below that, January 1938. He flipped through slowly. Entries about patients, weather, letters from home, observations about burn treatments and recovery times. Everything methodical, the handwriting of someone who believed in order. Then he reached October. October 15th, 1938. Captain D. lingered near the nurses' quarters again this evening. He apologized again for his proposal. I accepted graciously, but his attention feels suffocating. I cannot shake the feeling he is watching not just me, but what I write, where I go. October 18th, 1938. 3 burn patients this week report gaps in memory beyond normal anesthesia effects. When I mentioned this to Lieutenant Marsh, she suggested I take it higher if I was concerned, but cautioned about accusations without proof. I am not accusing, only observing. October 21st, 1938. Saw Captain D administering an injection to Private Walters personally. Unusual for a surgeon to handle routine medication. When I asked about the compound, he said it was a new anesthetic being tested, then asked if I was questioning his judgment. I was not, but now I wonder what I should have been questioning all along. The entries ended October 23rd. Thornton set the journal aside and picked up the photograph. It was a medical photograph, the kind taken in hospital settings with precision lighting. The woman in the image wore a nurse's uniform, her cap askew, hair disheveled. Her hands were bound in front of her with what looked like medical gauze. But it was her eyes that made Thornton's chest tighten. She was looking directly at the camera. Not vacant, not unconscious. Terrified, yes, but also defiant. The kind of look that said, "You will not erase me." Behind her, the brick walls of this exact coal chute were visible, and in the background, just barely in frame, a man's hand holding a syringe. "Detective?" The photographer leaned through the opening. "Find something?" "Yeah." Thornton's voice came out rough. He turned the photograph over. The inscription on the back was written in fountain pen, the letters precise. October 23rd, 1938. For the advancement of knowledge. R.D. Thornton read it twice, then carefully placed the photo in an evidence bag. He crawled back out into the basement proper, where Dale Krieger stood with his arms crossed, face gray. "That's her, isn't it?" Dale said. "In the photo, that's the woman we found." "Yes." "Jesus Christ." Dale looked away. "She was alive when he took that picture. You can see it in her face." Thornton didn't answer. He was already thinking about the initials. R.D., someone with access to a medical camera, someone who worked at this hospital in 1938. Someone who wrote, "For the advancement of knowledge," as if that explained sealing a living woman inside a coal chute. He climbed the stairs back to ground level, where the rest of his team waited with the Fort Riley police. Lieutenant Colonel Sandra Vega, the new CID commander, stood by one of the cruisers, arms folded against the Kansas heat. "Well?" "We've got a skeleton, a journal, and a photograph." Thornton held up the evidence bag. The photo shows the victim alive, bound, and sitting in that coal chute. It's dated October 23rd, 1938, and it's signed with initials. R.D. Vega took the bag, studied the image. Her expression didn't change, but her jaw tightened. This was staged. Documented. "Yes, ma'am." "The journal?" "Belongs to the victim. Lieutenant Sarah C. Holloway, Army Nurse Corps. Last entry is the same date as the photo." Thornton pulled out his notebook. "I need to get to records. Pull the file on her disappearance. There has to be one." "There is." The voice came from behind them. An older MP sergeant, weathered and gray, stepped forward. "Name's Everett. I've been at Riley since '68. Heard stories about a nurse who went missing back in the '30s, supposedly drowned in the flood. They still tell it sometimes during orientation. The ghost of the old hospital wing." "Not a ghost," Thornton said. "A murder." Everett nodded slowly. "Then you'll want the 1938 case files. They're in the archives, basement of Building 6. Everything from that era got boxed up when the Provost Marshal's office moved in '65. Vega looked at Thornton. "Go. Take Harris with you. I want every piece of paper related to Lieutenant Holloway on my desk by tomorrow morning." "Yes, ma'am." 3 hours later, Thornton and Specialist Harris sat surrounded by dusty boxes in the archives, a single desk lamp cutting through the windowless room. The 1938 files were meticulously organized. Someone had cared about procedure, even if they'd missed the truth. Harris pulled a folder from the stack. "Here. Holloway, Sarah C., Lieutenant, reported missing October 24th, 1938. He flipped it open. Investigator was Major Thomas Hartwell, Provost Marshal. Thornton scanned the report. Sarah had left the hospital around 7:45 p.m. on October 23rd, heading for the Junction City bus depot. Last seen by the depot clerk around 8:50 p.m., riding outside during a storm. Never made it home. Flash flood that night killed 2 other people in Junction City, swelled the Kansas River 8 feet above normal. Search efforts focused on the river. Harris read aloud, dragged for 3 weeks. Found her satchel in the mud, empty except for a compact mirror. Presumed drowned. Case closed December 1938. Who did they interview? Harris flipped pages. Hospital staff, fellow nurses, her landlady, Captain Richard Daventon, senior surgeon, Private First Class James Chen, medic. He paused. Chen's interview notes are rough. They really went after him. Thornton took the page. The questions were less investigative than accusatory. Describe the nature of your relationship with Lieutenant Holloway. Why would a white officer spend time with an enlisted Chinese man? Did you resent her refusal of your advances? They thought he did it, Harris said quietly, or they wanted someone easy to blame. Thornton kept reading. Chen had insisted Sarah was too careful to drown accidentally. He'd mentioned she was documenting irregularities in patient care. The interviewer had noted, subject became emotional and irrational. Testimony unreliable. What about Daventon? Harris found the interview transcript. Daventon stated he was concerned about Lieutenant Holloway. Said she seemed distressed after he proposed marriage 3 weeks prior, and she declined. He claimed she was too meticulous to have been caught in a flood. Interview notes say he appeared agitated but cooperative. Harris looked up. His family connections are mentioned. Father was a state senator in Kansas. Interview was kept brief out of respect for the family's grief. Thornton set down the papers and picked up the photograph again. R.D. Richard Daventon. Pull his service record, he said. Everything. Where he served, when he left Fort Riley, what happened to him. Harris went to the filing cabinets. 10 minutes later, he returned with a thick folder. Captain Richard Alastair Daventon, born 1896, commissioned 1918, too late for WWI combat. Stationed Fort Riley, 1935 to 1941. Specialty, burn treatment and trauma surgery. 41. He left Fort Riley in 41, transferred to Fort Sam Houston, then overseas in 42, made major in 43. Harris kept reading, his voice getting quieter. Pioneered new debridement techniques, published a textbook on burn treatment in 1950, promoted to colonel, decorated, retired 1958. He looked up. Died 1962 at Walter Reed. Natural causes. There's a commendation letter here calling him a pioneer in military medicine. The silence in the archive room felt heavy. He became a hero, Harris said finally. Thornton stared at the photograph of Sarah Holloway, bound and terrified in the coal chute, while the man who put her there went on to save lives and receive medals. He thought about the journal entries, the careful documentation of her suspicions, about Private Chen being interrogated like a criminal while Daventon's family connections kept questions polite and brief. "Get me a phone," Thornton said. "I need to call Colonel Vega." 30 minutes later, standing in the archive hallway with a rotary phone pressed to his ear, Thornton delivered his preliminary findings. The initials match Captain Richard Daventon, senior surgeon at Fort Riley in 1938. The victim's journal indicates she was documenting unauthorized medical procedures. Daventon. The metal filing cabinet drawer screeched open, releasing decades of trapped dust into the artificial light of Fort Riley's archive basement. Detective Paul Thornton sneezed twice, then pulled the accordion folder marked Personnel, Surgical Staff, 1936 to 1945, onto the scarred wooden table. Specialist Jennifer Harris, who'd been stationed at Fort Riley for 3 years without once visiting this tomb of bureaucracy, stood beside him. The photograph, that terrible photograph, lay protected in an evidence sleeve between them. Even through the plastic, Sarah Holloway's terrified eyes seemed to follow them. "Daventon, Richard A." Thornton read from the tab. "Here we go." The file was thicker than most. He spread the contents across the table. Commission papers, transfer orders, efficiency reports, commendations. The official narrative of a military career. Harris leaned over his shoulder. Born July 1896, Philadelphia. That would make him 42 in 1938. Commissioned 1918, served stateside during the Great War. Medical degree from Johns Hopkins, 1922. Impressive credentials, Thornton muttered. His finger traced down the assignment history. Posted to Fort Riley, October 1935. Senior surgeon by March 1936. He paused. That's only 5 months. Fast promotion. Family connections, Harris suggested. Thornton flipped to a personnel notation clipped to the inside cover. Someone, probably Major Hartwell himself, had written in careful script, Father, Alastair R. Daventon, Investment Banking, Philadelphia. Mother, Caroline Lockridge Daventon, relation to Senator Marcus. Lockridge, DPA. More than connections, Thornton said. The Lockridges practically owned Pennsylvania politics in the 30s. Harris was reading an efficiency report dated April 1938, 6 months before Sarah vanished. Listen to this. Captain Daventon demonstrates exceptional initiative in burn treatment protocols, has requested authorization for expanded research into pain management and tissue preservation, recommends establishing dedicated research ward. It's signed by the base hospital commander. Did they approve it? She shuffled papers. No formal approval here, but look. She held up a supply requisition from August 1938. He's ordering compounds I've never heard of, curare derivatives, experimental paralytics. Her voice dropped. This is 2 months before Lieutenant Holloway disappeared. Thornton's jaw tightened. He opened Sarah's journal to a page he'd marked earlier, reading aloud. Captain D insists on personally administering sedation to Corporal Barnes, despite my offer to assist. Patient later reports no memory of procedure. This is the 3rd such case this month. She was documenting it, Harris said quietly, building a record. And he knew. Thornton touched the photograph's edge. He had to have known. They worked in silence for 20 minutes, constructing a timeline from the scattered papers. Daventon's service record told a story of steady ascent. Commendations for innovative surgical techniques, published articles in military medical journals, glowing evaluations from superior officers who seemed eager to be associated with his rising star. Then Harris found the anomaly. Paul, look at this transfer order. The document was dated March 15, 1941. Captain Richard Daventon, effective immediately, reassigned from Fort Riley to Fort Sam Houston, San Antonio, Texas. No explanation, no ceremony, just gone. 3 years after Sarah, Thornton noted. Why the sudden move? Harris was already digging. She pulled another folder. Disciplinary Inquiries, 1940 to 1942. Inside, a thin file marked Confidential, Resolved. The inquiry had been initiated in January 1941 by Lieutenant Colonel Weber, the new base hospital commander who'd replaced Daventon's original patron. The complaint concerned irregularities in medical supply accounting and unauthorized research procedures. 3 enlisted men had reported strange gaps in their memory following minor surgeries. A nurse, not Sarah, who was long gone, had found unmarked vials in Daventon's office safe. The investigation lasted 6 weeks. Then, abruptly, case closed. Captain Daventon reassigned. Matter considered administratively resolved. No further action warranted. They buried it, Harris breathed. Someone upstairs shut it down. Thornton flipped to the last page, a handwritten note unsigned. Family has requested quiet resolution. Transfer accomplishes necessary goals without public embarrassment to the service. The Lockridges again, Thornton said. His voice was flat with disgust. They couldn't make it disappear completely, so they moved him, gave him a fresh start in Texas, where he could do it again. They stared at each other. Thornton's mind was already racing ahead to the 13 other disappearances Sarah's case might connect to. How many were at Fort Riley? How many at Fort Sam Houston? How many at Walter Reed, where Daventon had finished his distinguished career? Harris pulled the next section of Daventon's file. After Fort Sam Houston, he went to North Africa in 1942, attached to the 15th Evacuation Hospital, then Italy, 1943. She turned pages. This is where he made his reputation. Silver Star for treating burn casualties under fire at Anzio, promoted to major, then lieutenant colonel, by 1945. The commendations multiplied. Daventon had written the definitive Army manual on burn debridement in 1947. He testified before Congress on veteran medical care in 1950. By the time he retired in 1962, he was Colonel Richard A. Daventon, recipient of the Legion of Merit, consultant to 3 surgeons general. He died a hero, Harris said. October 1962, Walter Reed Army Medical Center. Natural causes. Heart failure. She looked up. There was a memorial service. The Surgeon General spoke. Thornton closed his eyes. The gap between the man in these files and the man who'd photographed Sarah Holloway's terror was so vast it felt like standing at a canyon's edge. Both versions were real. Both were documented. One had been celebrated while the other had been literally bricked up and forgotten. "What about family?" he asked. Harris found the personnel emergency contact form from 1938. Wife deceased, 1933. One daughter, Evelyn Lockridge Daventon, born 1924. She would be 14 when Sarah disappeared. She pulled out a more recent document, an update from Daventon's retirement file. As of 1962, Miss Daventon is listed as next of kin. Address in Georgetown. Evelyn Lockridge Daventon. Thornton repeated. The name tugged at his memory. Harris, isn't there a Senator Daventon from Maryland? Her face went pale. Oh, Christ. Senator Evelyn Daventon. Armed Services Committee. She's been in the Senate since 1972. They both understood immediately what this meant. The phone call Thornton would have to make. The media storm that would follow. A decorated war hero exposed as a serial killer. His daughter's political career imploding in the same revelation. "We need to verify everything," Thornton said. "Every date, every transfer, every commendation. This file doesn't leave this room until we're absolutely certain." But he already was certain. Sarah's journal had led them here. The photograph had confirmed it. And now these papers, these careful official papers that documented a monster's rise to respectability, completed the terrible picture. Harris was reading the last document in the file, Daventon's obituary from the Army Times. Colonel Daventon's. Pioneering techniques in burn treatment saved countless lives across 3 decades of service, she read. He will be remembered as one of the Army Medical Corps' finest officers. He should be remembered as a murderer, Thornton said quietly. They packed the files into evidence boxes, each page a piece of the truth that had been buried as deliberately as Sarah herself. Outside, through the basement's high windows, Thornton could see the Kansas sky turning the deep blue of early evening. Somewhere in this same landscape, 40 years ago, Sarah had walked toward the bus depot, carrying her journal and her courage and her doomed hope that truth mattered more than rank. She'd been wrong about that, at least in 1938. The truth hadn't mattered then. Daventon's connections, his brilliant reputation, the convenience of a flash flood, all of it had been enough to seal her fate and his freedom. But time, Thornton thought, carrying the boxes toward the stairs, had a way of unsealing things. Walls came down, secrets emerged. The dead found their voices in journals and photographs, speaking across decades to investigators who would finally listen. "We need to call Lieutenant Colonel Vega," he said, "and then we need to call Senator Daventon, before the press does." Harris nodded. They climbed the stairs together, carrying the weight of Richard Daventon's lies into the light of a June evening in 1978, 40 years and 8 months after he'd left Sarah Holloway to die in darkness. The decorated monster was about to be unmasked, and the journal lay open under the harsh beam of a forensic lamp, its leather cover stiff with decades of darkness. Special Agent Lila Forrester pulled her reading glasses higher on her nose and turned another page with gloved fingertips. The handwriting was neat at first, a methodical nurse's hand documenting ward duties, patient temperatures, medication schedules. She'd been working through it for 6 hours in the Fort Riley Evidence Processing Room. Dale Krieger's discovery 3 days ago had turned the entire base inside out. News vans lined the gates. Reporters shouted questions at anyone in uniform. The photograph of Lieutenant Sarah Holloway, terror frozen in silver gelatin, as had the Herishi already appeared in the Kansas City Star, her bound hands and wide eyes making readers look away and then look back, unable to resist the intimacy of her final moment. But the journal. This was where the real horror lived. Lila paused on an entry from early October 1938. Sarah's observations were clinical but concerned. Patient R. Jensen, burn ward, 3rd degree on left forearm from cavalry training. Standard morphine protocol. Dr. M. supervised debridement at 0900. Patient lucid throughout. Captain Daventon administered injection at 1400, not on chart. Patient reports no memory of afternoon, deeply confused. Asked sister if she'd visited. She had for 2 hours. This is the 4th incident this month. Captain D says it's normal post-trauma, dissociation, but these men weren't traumatized before the injections. Lila made a note on her legal pad. Unauthorized injections, memory erasure. The pages continued. Sarah documented 7 similar cases across 2 weeks. Then came personal entries that made Lila's throat tighten. Captain D approached me after shift, asked point-blank if I'd been keeping records of ward irregularities. His tone was friendly, but his eyes weren't. How did he know? I keep this journal at home, not on base. Has he been watching me? Following me? The next entry. Refused Captain D's dinner invitation for the 3rd time. He's a respected surgeon. I should be flattered. But something in the way he looks at me has changed since I started asking questions about the memory cases. It's like he's measuring me for something. Lila turned the page. The handwriting remained steady through mid-October, then shifted on October 23rd. The ink was different. Fountain pen instead of the earlier ballpoint. Sarah must have been writing at the bus depot, using the good pen she saved for letters home. Sunday evening, Junction City Depot. Storm coming in fast. Finished letter to mother. Didn't tell her about the trouble at work. No need to worry her. The weather looks biblical. Edgar, the depot clerk, already locked up early. I should have accepted James's offer to walk with me, but people talk enough about us already. A Chinese medic and a white officer walking together might as well paint targets on both our backs. The entry continued, more rushed. Captain D just appeared. His car, offering a ride. The rational part of me says yes. It's pouring. There's flooding. But my gut. The sentence stopped mid-word. When the writing resumed, the ink was smeared. The handwriting changed. Lila sat forward, her pulse quickening. I can't move. He injected me in the car. Somewhere on the river road. I'm awake. I can think. I can see and hear everything. But my body won't respond. Paralyzed. He's talking to me like we're having a normal conversation. Explaining the compound. Curare derivative, his own formulation. He says my questions made me an ideal subject for the conscious immobility study. Says the burn patients were preliminary. I was always the intended application. He's taken me into the hospital basement. It's after midnight. No one here. He's photographed me. Clinical documentation, he says, for the advancement of knowledge. He keeps saying that phrase like it absolves him. Lila's hands trembled as she turned to the next page. The writing was shakier now, the letters uneven. Still, can't move. He's left me in some kind of storage space. Coal chute, maybe. I can smell it. He brought a lamp so I can see to write. He wants me to document the experience from the subject's perspective. Gave me this journal from my satchel. My right hand is starting to regain sensation. He says the partial return is fascinating. Will extend the observation window. I asked him why. He said, I'd be immortal in the literature. That my sacrifice would save thousands of surgical patients once he perfects the conscious sedation protocol. He believes this. He's not raving. He's calm, methodical, the man I worked beside for 2 years. He's bricking up the opening. The next several pages were harder to read. Sarah's handwriting deteriorated as the hours passed. She wrote about the lamp dying, about calling out until her throat bled, about hearing footsteps above, morning rounds starting in the hospital and screaming until she passed out. Day 2. I think. No light. Writing by feel. Hand coordination returning slowly, but I'm so weak. He came back once, opened a brick to pass through a canteen of water, said he needed to ensure I remained conscious for the full progression, asked me to describe my psychological state. I spat at him. He seemed disappointed. Sealed the brick again. I've been scratching at the mortar between bricks with my compact mirror, the one from my satchel. It broke, and the edge is sharp. My fingers are bleeding, but I can feel them now. All of them. I can move my arms. If I can widen the gaps, if I can... Lila turned the page. The handwriting was nearly illegible now, words running together. Day 4, maybe 5. No water since he came. Can hear him sometimes through the wall. Whistling. Working in his office directly above, I think. He knows I'm still alive because I scratch when I hear him. He scratches back, like a game. Mother, I'm so sorry. Philadelphia feels like another life. James was right. I should have listened, should have reported everything sooner. Should have. The next entry was calmer. Resigned. Hallucinating. See father's face, he died when I was 9. See James sketching. See mother in her garden. The paralysis is gone completely now. Ironic. Can move everything except out of this box. Tried to break the bricks with the lamp base. Too weak. No leverage. My hands are destroying themselves on the mortar, but it's working. 2 bricks loose. Can see light through the gaps. Not much, but light. If I can create an opening, someone will find this. Have to believe that. Captain Richard Alastair Daventon. Fort Riley Base Hospital Surgical Ward. Experimental paralytic compounds. Unauthorized administration. Memory erasure protocols. At least 7 victims before me, maybe more. He keeps records. I saw the locked cabinet in his office. Whatever happens to me, someone needs to look there, please. The final pages were the worst. The writing came in fragments, words scattered across the paper like falling leaves. I can move my fingers, scratching at the bricks. He can hear me, he's on the other side, bricking faster, mother, I'm so sorry. Someone find this, his name is... The handwriting trailed into a series of deep, violent scratches that tore the paper. Lila turned the journal sideways. The scratches formed letters, carved rather than written. Daventon. Then nothing. The remaining pages were blank. Lila, carefully, closed the journal and removed her glasses. She sat in the silent room, fluorescent lights humming overhead. Through the window, she could see the old hospital wing, now a skeletal ruin surrounded by yellow crime scene tape. Sarah Holloway had been 29 years old, a dedicated nurse, a dutiful daughter, a woman who'd noticed something wrong and tried to do something about it. She'd spent nearly a week dying by inches in the dark, knowing exactly who'd put her there and why. And she'd used her final strength not to curse him, not to beg, but to leave a map for someone to follow. Lila picked up her phone and dialed the lead investigator. It's Forrester. I finished the journal. And? We need to contact the families of every person who went missing within a 50-mile radius of Fort Riley between 1936 and 1941. And we need to tear apart every building Daventon had access to. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was systematic. He perfected his technique on her. She looked down at the journal one more time. She documented everything. Lila said quietly, right up until the end. She knew what mattered. The agent on the phone was silent for a moment. The senator called again. Daventon's daughter, she wants the investigation contained. Tell the senator her father was a monster who conducted human experimentation in an army hospital basement, and her political career doesn't change that. Lila's voice was steady. Sarah Holloway made sure we'd know the truth. The least we can do is honor that. She hung up and began drafting her report, the scratched name echoing in her mind. Daventon. The woman who answered the door of the modest brick house in Bethesda wore reading glasses on a chain and a cardigan despite the June warmth. She studied the credentials Agent Lila Forrester presented, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Davies?" Lila kept her voice gentle. "I'm with Army Criminal Investigation. May we speak about your late husband?" "It's been 16 years." Margaret Davies' Kansas accent softened the words. "What could the Army possibly want now?" "We're reviewing personnel records from the 1930s and 40s. Your husband served at Fort Riley before the war, is that correct?" The woman's fingers tightened on the doorframe. "Richard was at several bases, Fort Riley, Fort Sam Houston, others. He was a medical administrator." "Not a physician?" "He had medical training but worked in hospital administration." Margaret glanced past Lila to the unmarked sedan where Specialist Harris waited. "Why are you asking these questions?" Lila chose her words carefully. "We're investigating irregularities in medical supply records from that period. Routine verification. May I come in?" The living room was neat, sunlight filtering through lace curtains onto family photographs. Lila scanned them quickly. A wedding portrait from the late 1940s. Children at various ages, grandchildren. Margaret Davies settled into an armchair, her hands folded in her lap with the control of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. "Mrs. Davies, when did you meet your husband?" 1946. He was working at Walter Reed, helping establish new burn treatment protocols for returning veterans. We married in 47. Her voice carried pride and something else, defensiveness perhaps. "Richard was brilliant, ahead of his time in understanding trauma care." "Did he ever mention Fort Riley?" A pause, barely perceptible. "He said the facilities were primitive. He preferred not to discuss that period." "Did he keep personal papers from his early career? Journals, photographs, research notes?" "Some boxes in the attic." Margaret's fingers worried the cardigan's buttons. "Agent Forrester, what exactly are you investigating?" Lila pulled Sarah's photograph from her briefcase, keeping it face down. "Mrs. Davies, in 1938, an Army nurse named Sarah Holloway disappeared from Fort Riley during a flood. Her remains were recently discovered sealed in the old hospital basement. We have evidence suggesting your husband was involved." The color drained from Margaret's face. "That's impossible. Richard was a healer. He saved lives. Did he ever mention conducting research involving paralytic compounds?" "Many physicians studied anesthetics. Unauthorized experiments. Human subjects who didn't consent." Margaret stood abruptly, her composure fracturing. "You need to leave. My husband died a respected man. Whatever you think you found, we found this." Lila turned the photograph over. Margaret Davies looked at Sarah Holloway's terrified face, at the bound hands, at the syringe visible in the background. She read the inscription on the back. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "When Richard died, I found a key in his desk. Small, brass, no label. I searched the whole house trying to understand what it opened." Her hands trembled. 3 years after his funeral, I was cleaning the garage. There was a toolbox bolted to the workbench. The key fit. Lila waited, her heart hammering. Inside were envelopes, dozens of them, each with a date and initials. I opened one. Margaret's eyes were wet now. It was a photograph like this one. Young man, conscious but paralyzed, strapped to a gurney. The look in his eyes. She pressed her fingers to her mouth. I burned them. All of them. I told myself it couldn't be what it looked like, that there must be an explanation, that my husband, my children's father— How many photographs? 23. The number came out strangled. I counted before I burned them. 23 envelopes spanning 1936 to 1941. I've lived with that number every day since. Did you recognize any locations in the backgrounds? Margaret nodded slowly. Fort Riley, Fort Sam Houston, Walter Reed had a different layout in some. The photographs showed different rooms, different equipment, but always the same. She couldn't finish. Mrs. Davies, we need to search your attic. If there are any remaining documents— I burned everything I found. But Richard was meticulous. If he kept those photographs hidden that carefully, there might be other places. Margaret straightened, decades of silent guilt giving way to something harder. I'll show you everything. The attic, the garage, his study. I should have come forward years ago. I told myself I was protecting my children, but I was protecting him, protecting myself. The attic was sweltering, dust motes dancing in shafts of light from a single bulb. Margaret pulled down 3 cardboard boxes marked R. Davies, Army Service. Inside, Lila found the careful documentation of an ordinary military career, transfer orders, commendations, duty rosters. But wedged in the bottom of the 3rd box, beneath a stack of medical journals, was a ledger. The entries were clinical, impersonal. Dates, times, dosages. Each page detailed administration of compounds with names Lila didn't recognize, derivatives of curare, experimental sedatives, combinations that shouldn't exist. Beside each entry, initials. SCH, JM, P, ERT.WSHUDIABU. Lila cross-referenced the dates with the missing persons files Harris had compiled. October 23, 1938. SCH. Sarah Catherine Holloway. March 14, 1937. JMP. Julia Marie Parsons, a laundress who'd vanished from Fort Riley, attributed to desertion. August 2, 1939. RTW, Robert Thomas Walsh, a civilian orderly, presumed drowned in the Kansas River. He numbered them, Lila said, her voice hollow, like specimens. Margaret stood in the attic doorway, tears streaming silently. When he talked about his burn treatment research, he was so passionate. He said his work would save thousands. I never questioned where the knowledge came from. Did your husband ever mention a darkroom? A place he developed his own photographs? He had the garage workshop, but... Margaret's face changed. Wait, in 1959, we sold our house in Virginia to move here. Richard insisted on hiring a separate truck just for his garage belongings. He wouldn't let the movers touch anything. He spent 2 days packing it himself. Did you ever see what he moved? Tool chests, mostly. He set up his workbench exactly the same way here. She descended the attic stairs, Lila following. But there was one trunk I never saw him open. He said it was old surgical equipment he couldn't bring himself to dispose of. The garage smelled of motor oil and sawdust. Margaret pointed to a military-style footlocker beneath the workbench, secured with a combination lock. I don't know the combination. I never tried. Lila called Harris from the car. 20 minutes later, they had the lock cut. Inside the footlocker, developing trays, chemical bottles with faded labels, and a leather portfolio sealed with straps. The portfolio contained negatives. Dozens of them, organized in glassine sleeves, each labeled with meticulous precision. Lila held one to the light and felt her stomach turn. We need to process these, she told Harris. All of them. Margaret Davies stood in her driveway as they loaded the boxes into the sedan, her arms wrapped around herself despite the heat. What happens now? We'll need a formal statement, and we'll be contacting families, people who've waited 40 years for answers. Will you tell them I knew? That I destroyed evidence? Lila considered the woman before her, aging, ordinary, complicit. I'll tell them you came forward. What you do with the rest of your life is up to you. Back at Fort Riley, the CID laboratory processed the negatives through the night. Each image appeared in the developing tray like a ghost materializing. Young faces, old faces, men and women, all sharing that same wide-eyed consciousness trapped in paralyzed bodies. 19 additional victims beyond Sarah and the others they'd already identified. The ledger provided names, dates, locations. Harris cross-referenced each one against missing persons reports from Kansas, Texas, Maryland. 12 matched cold cases. 7 had never been reported missing at all, transients perhaps, or people whose disappearances had been deliberately obscured. He moved between bases documenting his research, Harris said, laying out the timeline on the evidence board. Every time there was suspicion or inquiry, he transferred. His family connections smoothed the way. Lila studied the map, pins marking each victim's last known location. Fort Riley, Fort Sam Houston, Walter Reed, a geography of horror hidden in plain sight. "The dark room," she said suddenly. "Margaret said he dismantled it when they moved in '59, but where was it originally? He needed a space he controlled completely." Harris pulled Daventon's duty records. At Walter Reed, he had an office in the administrative annex. At Fort Sam Houston, he requisitioned a storage room adjacent to the surgical ward. But at Fort Riley, the hospital basement, where we found Sarah, Lila's hands clenched. He sealed her in his darkroom. She died surrounded by the evidence of his other victims. The photograph from Sarah's tomb took on new horror, not just documentation of her murder, but a trophy taken in the space where he'd developed all the others. How many times had he stood in that coal chute, watching images of paralyzed faces appear in the chemical baths? Lila reached for the phone. "I'm calling Senator Daventon. She needs to know before this breaks publicly." The senator's aide tried to deflect, but Lila's message was clear enough that within an hour, Evelyn Daventon herself returned the call. "Agent Forrester, my attorney has advised me not to speak with you directly. Senator, we've recovered additional evidence. Your father documented at least 23 victims between 1936 and 1941. We have his ledger, his negatives, corroborating testimony from his widow. The manila folder arrived on Agent Lila Forrester's desk at 9:47 a.m., stamped urgent in red ink, that hadn't quite dried. Inside were photocopied pages from hospital requisition logs 3 decades old, cross-referenced against personnel transfer records. Jennifer Harris had worked through the night. Lila spread the documents across her workspace. Fort Riley, 1936 to 1941. Fort Sam Houston, 1941 to 1945. Walter Reed, 1946 to 1962. Daventon's career path traced in neat columns. Below each location, Harris had listed names pulled from missing persons files cases marked cold, forgotten in basement archives across 3 states. 13 names, all young, all vanished near military installations where Richard Daventon had worked. The phone rang before she could finish reading. "Agent Forrester?" The voice was elderly, female, careful. "My name is Helen Kowalski. I saw the news about Fort Riley. About Captain Daventon." Lila grabbed her notepad. "Yes, ma'am. How can I help you?" A long pause, breathing on the line. Then, "I worked at Fort Sam Houston. Medical records, 1943 to 1945. Go on. There was a soldier, Private Daniel Morrison. Reported AWOL in February 1944. Helen's voice steadied, as if she'd rehearsed this moment for years. "But I saw him 2 days before he disappeared. He was in for burns on his hands and forearms. Training accident, they said. Colonel Daventon was treating him personally." Lila wrote fast. "Did you report this?" "I tried. My supervisor said Private Morrison had a history of instability, that the burns made him desperate, that he probably deserted." A bitter laugh. "But I saw the duty roster. Morrison never left the hospital grounds. His personal effects were still in the ward locker 3 weeks later. What happened to those effects? Disposed of. Colonel Daventon signed the disposal authorization himself." Lila underlined the name twice. "Mrs. Kowalski, would you be willing to give a formal statement? That's why I'm calling." Another pause. "Agent Forrester, there's something else. In April 1944, I was working late, filing patient discharge summaries. I needed a form from Colonel Daventon's office. The door was unlocked, so I went in." The line went quiet. Lila waited. There were photographs on his desk. Medical photographs, I thought, but one was turned face up, a young woman sitting against a wall. Her eyes? Helen's voice cracked. "I've never forgotten those eyes." She looked terrified, and there was something wrong with the way she was positioned, like she couldn't move, but she was trying to. "Did you recognize her?" "No, but I recognized the wall behind her. It was brick, old brick, like the basement storage areas at Fort Riley. I'd been stationed there briefly in 1939. I knew those walls." Lila's pen stopped moving. "What did you do?" Colonel Daventon came back, found me standing there. He was very calm, very polite. He said the photographs were research documentation for a burn treatment study, that the woman was a volunteer who'd been sedated for skin grafting. Helen's breathing quickened, but her clothes weren't hospital issue, and there was no medical equipment in the photograph. Just her, and the wall, and her eyes. Did he say anything else? He asked me not to mention what he had seen, said the research was sensitive, that premature disclosure could jeopardize funding. Then he offered me a transfer to a better position in the main administration building. The bitterness returned. I took it. I was 23 years old. He was a decorated colonel. I took the transfer and I kept my mouth shut. Lila glanced at Sarah Holloway's photograph still pinned to her evidence board. The same brick wall, the same terror. "Mrs. Kowalski, you did the right thing calling. 34 years too late. Better late than silent." After Helen hung up, Lila sat staring at the wall map Shed created. Red pins marked Fort Riley. Blue pins marked Fort Sam Houston. Yellow pins marked Walter Reed. Around each location, smaller pins indicated disappearances, service members, local civilians, transients. The pattern was obvious now. Wherever Daventon went, people vanished. Harris knocked and entered without waiting. Her eyes were bloodshot. I found 3 more, all from Fort Sam Houston, all between 1942 and 1944, all reported as desertions or accidental deaths. Names: Private Daniel Morrison, Specialist Robert Chen, Nurse Lieutenant Patricia Vance. Harris dropped another folder. Morrison was reported AWOL, February 1944. Chen drowned in the San Antonio River, July 1943. Vance died in a traffic accident, November 1942. Convenient accidents. Very. Harris pulled out a photograph, black and white, grainy. This is from the San Antonio Express-News, July 1943. Chen's body was found 3 miles downstream from Fort Sam Houston. The article says he was an experienced swimmer. Water conditions were calm. Lila studied the image. A covered body on a riverbank. Investigators standing nearby. In the background, barely visible, a figure in an Army officer's uniform watching from the road. The face was too distant to identify clearly. "Harris, can we enhance this? Already sent it to imaging. They'll have results by tomorrow." The phone rang again. Lila answered. "Forrester. Agent Forrester, this is Dr. Marcus Sullivan, Montgomery County Medical Examiner's Office." His voice carried the flat exhaustion of someone who'd seen too much. "You requested we review our 1962 files on Colonel Richard Daventon's death." "Yes. What did you find?" "Standard heart attack. Died at Walter Reed, attended by the cardiology staff. Nothing unusual in the autopsy report." A pause. "But there's a note attached from the attending nurse. She mentioned Daventon was lucid until the end, and in his final hours he kept asking for his research materials from his home office. Did anyone retrieve them? His daughter did. Senator Daventon. She came to the hospital the night he died, left with 2 boxes from his personal effects." Lila gripped the phone tighter. "What happened to those boxes? No record. They weren't inventoried as medical materials, so they didn't. Stay at Walter Reed." After she hung up, Lila sat in silence. 2 boxes, 40 years ago. Somewhere, possibly, the remaining photographs existed. The other victims. The complete record of Daventon's crimes. She picked up the phone and dialed the number she'd been avoiding. "Senator Daventon's office. This is Special Agent Lila Forrester, Army CID. I need to speak with the senator. It's regarding her father's estate." 20 minutes later, Evelyn Daventon's voice came through the line, clipped and controlled. "Agent Forrester, I've been expecting this call. Senator, I'm investigating a series of deaths connected to your father's service record. I need to ask about personal materials removed from Walter Reed in 1962. A long silence. Then, carefully, "What materials?" "The attending nurse noted you took 2 boxes from your father's hospital room the night he died." I need to know what was in those boxes. Personal papers, letters, nothing relevant to any investigation. Senator, I'm going to be direct. We have evidence your father murdered at least 23 people between 1936 and the early 1950s. We have his personal ledger, we have photographs, we have victim testimony from his widow. Lila paused. If there are additional materials that could help identify other victims, I need them. Those families deserve closure. Another silence, longer this time. When Evelyn spoke again, her voice had changed. Thinner, older. There were photographs. In the first box, medical photographs, I thought, but some of them. She stopped. Go on. Some showed people who looked frightened, bound. I didn't understand what I was seeing at first. I was 26 years old. My father had just died. I thought they were from some kind of wartime research, trauma victims, something documented for teaching purposes. What did you do with them? I burned them. The words came fast, defensive. In 1974, during my first Senate campaign, an opponent started digging into family history. I went through everything in my father's papers, vetting for anything that could be used against me. I found the photographs again. This time I looked closer, and I knew. I knew what they showed. Lila closed her eyes. How many photographs? 17. Evelyn's voice broke. 17 people, all looking at the camera like they were looking at death. So I burned them. I told myself it was protecting his legacy, protecting my career, but I knew. God help me, I knew what he'd done, and I destroyed the evidence. Senator Daunt. Sharp again. Controlled. Don't tell me I did the right thing by calling you now. Don't tell me I'm brave. I'm a coward who let 17 families live without answers because I cared more about my father's reputation than the truth. Did you recognize anyone in the photographs? No, but each one had a date on the back. The earliest was 1937. The latest was 1950. Lila did the math. 17 additional victims beyond the 23 already documented. At least 40 people, maybe more. Senator, I need you to come to Fort Riley and give a formal statement. Everything you remember about those photographs. Dates, descriptions, anything that might help us identify the victims. I'll be there tomorrow. Evelyn's voice steadied. Agent Forrester, there's one more thing. The second box. I didn't burn everything. Lila sat forward. What's in it? I don't know. I never opened it. After I burned the photographs, I couldn't. I sealed it and put it in a storage unit in Alexandria. It's been there for 4 years. I need that box, Senator. I'll have my office send you the location and access information. A pause. The sealed storage unit in Alexandria smelled of cardboard and time. Agent Lila Forrester stood in the narrow aisle between stacked boxes, watching Jennifer Harris photograph each angle of the unit's interior before they touched anything. Senator Evelyn Daventon waited in her idling Cadillac outside the facility, having provided the key and code but refusing to witness what came next. Her hands had shaken when she handed over the access information that morning. There, Harris said, pointing her flashlight at a military footlocker shoved against the back wall. That's got to be it. The locker was olive drab, standard Army issue, with R.A. Daventon stenciled in white paint across the lid. A master lock secured the hasp. Mrs. Davies said she gave you bolt cutters? Harris asked. Lila nodded, producing them from her equipment bag. The lock snapped cleanly. She knelt before the footlocker, gloved hands hovering over the lid. 4 years this has been sitting here, Harris said quietly. Since 1974. She's known what was in the other box all that time. She burned those photos to protect her daughter's career. Lila lifted the lid. But she couldn't bring herself to destroy this one. Couldn't look inside either. The footlocker's interior was meticulously organized. At the top lay 3 leather-bound journals, their spines cracked with age. Beneath them, a wooden box about the size of a cigar case. Wrapped in canvas at the bottom, something heavy and rectangular. Lila opened the first journal. The handwriting was precise, clinical, dated entries spanning 1936 to 1941. She read aloud. Subject SCH. Responds predictably to reduced dosage. Consciousness remains intact at 0.75 milligrams per kilogram. Vocalization attempts continue despite paralysis. Documentation attached. Her voice went flat. He kept a research log. The whole thing was research to him. Harris photographed each page as Lila turned them. The entries detailed 17 subjects by initials. Each had dates, weights, dosages, observations. Some entries included sketches, anatomical drawings showing injection sites, restraint positions. Look at this. Lila pointed to a March 1940 entry. Subject AKM. Enlisted personnel. Fort Sam Houston. Initial resistance required secondary sedation before primary compound administration. Subject displayed unexpected tolerance, necessitating increased dosage. AKM. That could be Alice Martinez. She went missing from Fort Sam in 1940. Her family's been waiting 38 years. The wooden box contained glass photographic plates, individually wrapped in tissue paper. Harris counted them as Lila carefully removed each one. 23 plates total. Lila held the first plate up to her flashlight. The image stopped her breath. A young woman in a hospital gown sat against a brick wall, arms bound at her sides. Her eyes stared directly at the camera, wide and aware. Behind her stood a figure in surgical scrubs, face deliberately kept out of frame, holding a clipboard. The plate was labeled in Daventon's handwriting. Subject JMP. Fort Riley. April 1937. Julia Parsons, Lila whispered. She was a cafeteria worker, 22 years old. They found her coat by the Kansas River. Harris unwrapped another plate. A man in army fatigues strapped to what looked like an examination table. His mouth was open in a scream, but his body remained perfectly still. Subject RT, Fort Sam Houston, June 1940. Robert Walsh, Harris said, checking her notes. Private. Reported AWOL. No one ever questioned it. They worked through the plates in silence. Each one a life stolen, documented, preserved as scientific evidence. Some of the subjects looked terrified. Others appeared resigned, as if they'd exhausted themselves fighting. All of them were conscious, aware, trapped in their own paralyzed bodies. The final plate showed a woman Lila recognized immediately from 40 years of deterioration. Lieutenant Sarah Holloway, sitting in the coal chute that would become her tomb, still defiant in the photograph Daventon had placed in her lap before sealing the bricks. This was his archive, Lila said, his proof of concept. He was going to publish someday, wasn't he? Make himself famous twice over. A canvas bundle, Harris said. Lila unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a pristine leather portfolio embossed with Daventon's name. She opened it to find a typed manuscript, perfectly formatted, complete with citations and methodology sections. The title page read, Conscious Immobilization, a Study in Paralytic Compounds and Human Resilience, by Captain Richard A. Daventon, M.D., U.S. Army Medical Corps. He wrote a whole paper, Harris said. Tables, figures, everything. Lila flipped through the pages. The abstract described groundbreaking research into consciousness retention under total muscular paralysis, with applications for battlefield anesthesia and surgical procedures. The methodology section clinically detailed subject procurement, dosing protocols, observation procedures. The results section included quotes from the subjects themselves, apparently transcribed from attempts to speak while paralyzed. Short, broken phrases that Daventon had noted phonetically. Plea, opie, can, ear, why, e. The discussion section praised the remarkable resilience of human consciousness and noted that subjects remained aware for an average of 4 to 6 days after final dosing ceased, depending on hydration and ambient conditions. Sarah Holloway was listed in Table 4 as Subject 12. Her observation period was documented as 6 days, terminated by respiratory failure secondary to dehydration. He'd watched her die over nearly a week and recorded her decline in a data table. Lila closed the portfolio, her hands steady despite the rage building in her chest. He was going to wait until after his death, have someone publish it posthumously, make himself a legend. But he died too soon, Harris said. Heart attack in 1962, age 66. His daughter got his effects before he could arrange publication, and Evelyn saw the truth her father had hidden. Lila carefully returned the manuscript to the portfolio. She burned the first box of photos in 1974 when her Senate campaign got serious, but she couldn't destroy the research itself. Too complete, too documented. So she locked it away and tried to forget. Until a demolition crew found her father's first victim sealed in a wall. Lila stood, looking at the evidence arrayed on the concrete floor. 23 glass plates, 3 research journals, a manuscript ready for publication, and a footlocker that had waited 4 years to reveal its horror. "We need to photograph everything in place before we move it," she said. "Then we get it all to the lab at Quantico. I want copies of the manuscript distributed to every investigative team working the related disappearances." "The families deserve to know," Harris said. "They deserve more than knowing. They deserve the whole truth, documented and official." Lila looked at the portfolio again. Daventon thought this would make him immortal. Instead, it's going to be the evidence that names every single one of his victims. Outside, Evelyn Daventon sat in her car, staring at nothing. When Lila tapped on the window, the senator didn't move. Lila opened the door. "We're going to need you to come to Fort Riley tomorrow. Full deposition, on the record." "How many?" Evelyn's voice was hollow. 23 photographic plates, 17 documented subjects in his journals. The numbers overlap. Some victims have both photos and journal entries. We're cross-referencing with the missing persons database now. He died a hero. They gave him a military funeral. I gave the eulogy. Evelyn's eyes were red. "I told the crowd he'd dedicated his life to healing. You didn't know what he was then. But I've known since 1974. 4 years, Agent Forrester. I've been a United States Senator for 4 years, knowing my father was a murderer, knowing there was proof locked in a storage unit I could have opened any time. You're opening it now, because I got caught." Evelyn finally looked at her. "Be honest. If that photograph hadn't been found, if Sarah Holloway had stayed buried, would I have ever unlocked that footlocker?" Lila didn't answer. The truth sat between them, heavy and immovable. "I thought. Burning those first photos would be enough," Evelyn continued. "I told myself the victims were already dead, that exposing him wouldn't bring them back, that it would only destroy the living, me, my children, everyone who'd benefited from his medical innovations. I convinced myself I was protecting people." "Who were you really protecting, Senator?" Evelyn's face crumpled. "Myself. I was protecting myself and calling it mercy." A semi-truck rumbled past on the highway beyond the storage facility's fence, normal life continuing, oblivious to what had just been unearthed. "The deposition tomorrow," Lila said. "I need you to explain exactly what you saw in 1974 when you retrieved those first boxes from Walter Reed. Every detail, the families waiting for answers about their missing daughters, sons, brothers, sisters. They need to hear it from you. Will it help them? Truth always helps, even when it comes 40 years too late." Evelyn nodded slowly. She started her car, then paused. "Agent Forrester? That manuscript my father wrote, what happens to it? Evidence. Then, eventually, archives. He wanted to be remembered as a pioneer. Don't let that happen. Whatever innovations came from his war service, whatever lives his burn treatment saved, they don't balance the scale. They never could. The only thing he'll be remembered for now is what he actually was," Lila said. "A monster who tortured 23 people and documented their suffering like a science fair project." After Evelyn drove away, Lila returned to the storage unit. Harris had finished photographing the contents and was carefully packing everything into evidence boxes. "Transportation sending a secure truck," Harris said. "Should be here within the hour." Lila picked up one of the photographic plates, holding it carefully by the edges. The young woman,